She had nothing left but her name, and even that was being taken from her. In a town where power belonged to men with money, Clara Vance made a choice that would change her fate forever. She asked a stranger to pretend to love her, but what she found instead was something far deeper. In a land of silence, buried truths, and unspoken pain, two broken souls begin a journey neither of them planned.
Dust hung in the Millhaven air. Thick, heavy. It tasted like rusted iron and dried sweat. A Tuesday in late September. The kind of day that baked the fight right out of a person. The Montana sun beat down on the wooden boardwalks. It warped the pine planks. It made the air shimmer above the dirt road. Except for Clara Vance. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. She stood outside the Mercantile, her back straight, her hands folded tightly to hide the shaking. Beside her, Amos Pike, the labor broker, was shouting numbers to a sparse, sweaty crowd. And directly in front of her stood Sterling, her cousin, her tormentor. Sterling adjusted his silk vest. He didn't belong in this dirt. He belonged in a bank or a courtroom. He looked at Clara like she was a ledger with a math error, something to be corrected and filed away. "It's a simple signature, Clara," Sterling said. His voice was smooth, too smooth, like oil over a trap. He held out a piece of heavy parchment. A train ticket to Chicago sat on top of it. "Sign away the inheritance. Take the ticket, or I leave you here for the county asylum. A woman alone out here, without a male guardian? The territorial courts will lock you up by Friday. They'll say you've lost your mind." Clara stared at the ticket. Chicago. Exile. A polite prison instead of an iron one. "My father left that land to me," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Your father was a fool," Sterling snapped. He leaned in close. His breath smelled of expensive cigars and cheap coffee. "Women don't own land out here. They marry it, or they lose it. Choose." Clara looked past him. She scanned the crowd. Men with hard hands and empty eyes. Drifters. Gamblers. Farmhands looking for winter work. None of them could stand up to Sterling's money. None of them cared to try. Then she saw him. Elias Thorne. He stood near the edge of the boardwalk, away from the noisy crowd. He wore a faded canvas coat, a battered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He was looking at Amos Pike's labor contracts. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken a single word since he rode into town 4 years ago. People said he was a mute. People said his mind was broke. But they stepped out of his way when he walked down the street. Even Sterling had stepped back when Elias walked past the saloon earlier that morning. Elias was solid, like the Beartooth Mountains behind him, immovable. Clara made her choice. It was a desperate one, but desperation was all she had left. She stepped around Sterling. She walked straight up to the silent rancher. Elias didn't look up right away. He was tracing a thick, calloused finger down a printed contract. Clara stepped closer, close enough to smell cedar wood, saddle leather, and honest sweat. She leaned in. She kept her voice low. Just a whisper in the dust. "I'll pay you $500 to pretend you love me," she whispered. Elias stopped. His finger paused on the paper. He turned his head slowly. He looked at her. His eyes were the color of a winter sky. Cold, clear, piercing right through the act she was putting on. "Be my fiancée," Clara breathed. The words tumbled out fast now. "Just on paper, just for show. I need your protection to take back what is mine. Sterling won't cross you. Everyone knows that. $500, cash, when I get my inheritance back." Elias stared at her. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He reached into his deep coat pocket. He pulled out a small slate chalkboard. A piece of chalk dangled from a leather string. He wiped the slate clean with the heel of his thumb. He wrote, fast, deliberate. The chalk scraped against the slate, a harsh, decisive sound. He turned the board around. $40. Clara blinked. Her heart hammered against her ribs. I said 500. For the marriage, for the protection. Elias erased the board. He wrote again. He tapped the chalk against the slate for emphasis. 2 sharp taps. A labor contract. I don't need money to love someone, even if it's pretend. He wasn't going to be her fake husband. He wasn't going to take her bribe, but he was offering her a way out. A legitimate contract. Room, board, and a solid wall between her and Sterling. He was buying her time for the price of a standard ranch hand. Elias pulled 2 $20 gold pieces from his pocket. He dropped them on Amos Pike's table. They clinked loud against the wood. Pike didn't ask questions. He handed Elias the standard indentured labor contract. Sterling pushed through the crowd. His face was blotchy red. The smooth veneer was gone, replaced by ugly anger. "What do you think you're doing?" Sterling hissed. He reached out and grabbed Clara's arm, hard. "You can't go with him. He's a crippled mute. He's nobody. You belong with your family. You belong under my authority." Clara wrenched her arm free. The heat in her chest flared into a wildfire. The polite silence of her upbringing broke wide open. She didn't whisper this time. She wanted everyone to hear. She needed them to hear. "I do not belong under anyone's authority, Sterling," Clara said. Her voice rang out across the boardwalk. Clear, steady, loud enough to stop a passing wagon. Sterling sneered. He tried to laugh, but it came out cruel. "You are a woman. You have no legal standing without a husband or a father. You are nothing without me." Clara stepped forward. She didn't back down an inch. "My dignity is not a commodity for you to appraise, and my life is not a ledger you get to balance for your own profit." The crowd went dead quiet. Even Amos Pike stopped shuffling his papers. The wind seemed to hold its breath. "Listen to me, Sterling," Clara continued. Every word was sharp. Cut glass. "The right to live independently is a fundamental human right. It is not a privilege granted by men. It is not a prize won through marriage. I have a mind, I have a will, and I will not be bought, bullied, or forced out of my own existence." Sterling stared at her. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked around. The drifters, the ranchers. They were all watching him lose to a woman. "You talk about the law," Clara said. "But your law is just greed wearing a suit. I am a human being, equal in worth, equal in right, and I am walking away." She turned her back on him, the ultimate insult in the West. Elias watched her. He didn't clap, he didn't smile, but he nodded, just once. A slow, respectful dip of his chin. He handed her the labor contract. He pointed to the bottom line. She took the pen from Amos Pike's inkwell. She signed her name, Clara Vance, free woman, indentured laborer. Elias turned and walked toward his wagon. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. Clara picked up her small, faded carpet bag. She looked at Sterling one last time. He was clutching the train ticket, his face pale with fury and disbelief. She left him standing in the dust. She climbed up onto the hard wooden bench of Elias Thorne's wagon. Elias flicked the leather reins. The draft horses leaned into the harness. The wooden wheels groaned against the dirt. They rolled out of Millhaven. Out of the noise, out of the trap, they headed toward the mountains, toward the silence. Clara sat beside the mute rancher. She had exactly $40 to her name in the form of a labor contract. She had no home. She had a ruthless cousin who would soon be hunting her legacy. But as the wind hit her face, tasting less like dust and more like pine, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she was driving her own road. The wagon hit a deep rut. Clara held the wooden seat. Her knuckles went white. She didn't complain. She didn't speak. She just watched the road. The dirt track wound away from Millhaven, away from the telegraph wires, away from Sterling. The plains opened up, vast, empty. The grass was turning the color of old pennies in the autumn sun. The Beartooth Mountains loomed ahead, jagged rock cutting into a pale blue sky. Elias drove the team. His hands were loose on the reins. He didn't push the horses. He knew the pace. He knew the land. He didn't look at her. 2 hours passed. Just the creak of the wagon, the thud of hooves, the wind rushing through the dry sagebrush. They crested a low hill. The Thorn Ranch sat in the valley below. It wasn't a grand estate. No white fences, no painted shutters. It was built to survive, not to impress. A sturdy log cabin, a large barn, a corral made of thick, weathered timber, a stone smokehouse. A creek ran behind the property, lined with yellowing willow trees. It looked lonely. It looked safe. Elias pulled the wagon into the yard. He set the brake. He stepped down. He didn't offer his hand. He walked straight to the horses to unhitch them. Clara climbed down on her own. Her boots hit the dust. It felt different here. Firmer. Quieter. Elias pointed toward the cabin. A simple gesture. Go inside. She walked up the wooden steps. She pushed the door open. It smelled of cold ash, chopped cedar, and old coffee. The main room was clean, sparse, a cast-iron stove, a heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf holding a few worn books and tins of supplies. Elias walked in behind her. He carried her small carpet bag. He walked past her to a door at the back of the room. He opened it, set the bag inside. Clara followed. The room was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window looking out at the mountains. Elias turned to face her. He reached into his canvas coat. He pulled out a heavy iron key. He held it out. Clara looked at his calloused palm. She took the key. She looked at the door. There was a lock on the inside. She met his eyes. They were winter sky blue, calm, unreadable. "Thank you," Clara whispered. Elias nodded once. He turned and walked out, back to the horses, back to his chores. Evening came fast. The temperature plummeted the second the sun dipped behind the peaks. Elias built a fire in the stove. He cooked beans, sliced salt pork, boiled bitter coffee. They sat at the heavy table. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp. They ate. The silence was thick. It pressed against Clara's ears. It was louder than the noise of the town. She was a woman of words. She read books. She debated ideas. She used language to survive. This total absence of sound was suffocating. She set her fork down. It clattered against the tin plate, a sharp, violent sound. Elias looked up. "We have a contract," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but tight. "I am here. You are here. But we need rules." Elias wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He reached down beside his chair. He brought up his small slate chalkboard. He wiped it clean with a rag. "Sterling won't give up," Clara said. She leaned forward. The lamplight caught the gold in her hair. "He will send someone, a spy, a lawyer. He needs to prove I am incompetent or lying. He needs to break this arrangement. If anyone comes, we have to be convincing. We are engaged. We are partners." Elias picked up his chalk. He wrote, fast. The scratching filled the room. He turned the board around. "I am a ranch hand on paper, nothing more." "Paper only matters in a courtroom," Clara fired back. "Out here, perception is reality. But I need more than just a physical guard. I need to fight him. I need to use the law against him." She stood up. She paced the small room. "I have to write to the territorial judge," she said. "I need to file an injunction, freeze my father's estate. I need to prove I am of sound mind and capable of managing my own affairs." Elias watched her. He wiped the slate. He wrote a longer paragraph, deliberate, heavy strokes. He turned the board around, pushed it toward her across the rough wood. Clara stopped pacing. She read his handwriting. It was neat, educated. "My silence is a self-made prison. But your lack of legal rights is an iron shackle forged by society. We are both inmates trying to dig our way out. You use ink, I use dirt." Clara stared at the chalk words. She looked up at Elias. The man wasn't just quiet. He was watching everything. He understood the mechanics of the trap she was in. She sat back down. She placed her hands flat on the table. "You're right," Clara said. Her voice dropped. It lost the panic. It gained steel. "I am shackled. A woman without property is considered a child in the eyes of the law." Elias didn't look away. He listened, truly listened. "I cannot sign a bank loan," Clara stated. She pronounced each word with careful, sharp precision. "I cannot vote on the taxes that drain my father's estate. The law dictates that a woman must be governed by a father, a husband, or a male relative. It is not just unfair. It is a systematic denial of human dignity." Elias nodded slowly. "Sterling thinks he owns my future," Clara said. Her jaw tightened. "Because society tells him he does. They hand men the keys to our cages. But equality isn't a gift they hand down from the bench. It's a right you have to claim. And I am claiming it." Elias picked up the chalk. He wiped the board. "I will work the land. You work the law. We dig together." Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She smiled. A small, fierce thing. "Agreed." The next week became a quiet dance, a routine built on action, not conversation. Elias taught her the reality of the ranch. He didn't speak, he showed. Morning frost covered the yard. Elias handed her an axe. He pointed to the chopping block. He placed his hands over hers, corrected her grip, showed her the angle, the momentum. She swung. The blade bounced, her hands stung. She swung again. The wood splintered. She chopped until her palms blistered, until the blisters popped. She didn't stop. He didn't tell her to stop. He respected her grit. In the evening, she worked the law. She sat by the kerosene lamp. She drafted letters. She quoted statutes. She argued precedent. Sometimes she read them aloud to Elias while he oiled his boots or sharpened his knife. He listened. Sometimes he stopped working. He would pick up his slate, point out a weak argument. He had a brilliant mind for loopholes. He knew government bureaucracy. They were building something, not a romance, not yet. It was an alliance, a fortress made of chopped pine and spilled ink. They were two people learning how to survive a world that wanted them silent. Autumn deepened. The wind grew teeth. It bit through Clara's thin wool coat. She walked the property line. A Tuesday afternoon. Elias was a mile away in the north pasture. He was mending a wire fence. Clara needed to move. The cabin felt too small. The legal letters were sent. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence of the ranch gave her too much time to think. She walked behind the stone smokehouse. The wind died down back here. It felt sheltered, but it didn't feel right. She looked at the ground. The grass changed. Near the creek it was tall and golden, but here in a wide circle behind the stone building the grass was pale, sickly, stunted. The earth dipped, a massive, unnatural depression. It looked like a sunken grave, only it was 20 feet across. Clara stopped at the edge. The air felt heavy, cold, like stepping into a root cellar. She walked into the center of the depression. She looked down. The dirt was loose in patches. She kicked a rock with the toe of her boot. The sound was wrong. It didn't thud against solid earth. It echoed. Just a fraction. Too hollow. A shiver raced down her spine. The hair on her arms stood up. The earth remembers what the law tries to forget. Clara spun around. Her hand flew to her throat. A man stood at the edge of the property line, just beyond the wooden fence. He hadn't made a sound. He was older. His skin was the color of aged saddle leather, deeply lined. His hair was iron gray, tied back with a leather strip. He wore a heavy wool coat. He stood completely still, like a pine tree rooted in the rock. Chief Alawan. Clara caught her breath. Her heart hammered. "You startled me." Alowan did not smile. He did not apologize. He looked at the sunken ground. Then his dark eyes moved to her. "You do not belong to the silent man," Alowan said. His English was perfect, precise. "I work for him," Clara said. She kept her chin up. She refused to show fear. "And he protects me." Alowan nodded. A slow, heavy movement. "He needs protection, too, from his own memory." Clara took a step toward the fence. "Who are you?" "I am Alowan," he said. "My people lived in this valley. We hunted beside that creek, long before the ink dried on your government papers." Clara looked out at the vast plains, the rolling hills. "My cousin is trying to steal my inheritance, land my father bought back east. I am fighting for my rights. I am fighting to be recognized by the law." Alowan rested a scarred hand on the wooden fence post. His gaze was piercing. It stripped away her polite defenses. "You fight for a piece of paper," Alowan said. His voice was a deep rumble, like distant thunder. "You fight for the right to own. But you must understand what you are standing on. The earth does not belong to us, Clara Vance. We belong to the earth." Clara frowned. Her legal mind pushed back. "The law says otherwise. The law says land can be surveyed, bought, sold, owned." "The law of men," Alowan said. His tone held no anger, only a profound, weary sadness. "You cannot build a righteous future on a foundation of stolen history. Your men draw lines on maps. They write names in heavy ledgers. They believe this gives them dominion over the dirt." He pointed a finger at the sunken ground behind her. "It is an illusion," Alowan continued. "A dangerous, bloody illusion. True justice requires acknowledging the lives destroyed to clear this land. Your law only protects the thief who wrote the rules." Clara felt the weight of his words. They hit her like a physical blow. She had been so consumed by her own injustice, Sterling's cruelty, the sexism of the courts. She hadn't looked past her own pain. "You're talking about historical accountability," Clara said. The words tasted formal, but the truth in them was raw. "You're saying my fight for women's rights is incomplete if I ignore what happened to your people." Alowan nodded. The wind caught his gray hair. "Oppression is a shared shadow," Alowan stated explicitly. "You cannot banish it from your own house while letting it consume your neighbors. You demand equality from your cousin. But do you demand equality for the people buried under your boots? Your fight for justice must include the truth of this soil, or it is just another form of theft." Clara looked back at the massive depression. The hollow place. "What is buried there?" Clara asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Alowan didn't look at the pit. He looked at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney. "He is a man drowning in dry dirt," Alowan said softly. "He took a vow of silence because his words once built a graveyard. He translates his guilt into backbreaking labor. But sweat does not wash away sins. Only truth does." "What did Elias do?" Clara pleaded. She stepped right up to the fence. "Ask him," Alowan said. He turned away from the boundary line. He began to walk, slow, purposeful, fading into the tall grass. "Ask him what the government paid him to translate. Ask him what the bones remember." Clara stood alone at the fence line. The wind picked up. It howled through the canyon. She looked down at her blistered hands. She was fighting for dignity, for the right to exist as a free woman. It was a righteous fight, but Elias was fighting a ghost he helped create. She walked back to the cabin. The sky was turning the color of bruised plums. Elias was at the woodpile. He was splitting logs for the night. The heavy axe rose and fell, a brutal, perfect rhythm. He didn't stop when she approached. She watched the sweat run down his neck, the tight lines of his jaw. He was punishing himself. Every swing of the iron blade was a penance for a crime she didn't understand. Sterling was a villain of simple greed, a monster built of money and arrogance. But Elias was a complex tragedy, a good man broken by a bad system. "Elias," Clara said. He paused. The axe head rested on the scarred chopping block. He looked at her. "I met Alwyn," she said. Elias froze. His knuckles turned stark white on the axe handle. He didn't reach for his slate in his pocket. He stopped breathing. "He told me about the land," Clara continued. She kept her voice steady, holding the rhythm. "He told me true justice means facing the past. Not just my past with Sterling, but the past of this place." She took a step closer. She looked directly into his winter sky eyes. They were wide now, guarded, terrified. "He said your words built a graveyard," Clara whispered. The words hung in the cold air. "He said I should ask you what the bones remember." Elias let go of the axe. It stayed wedged in the wood. He backed away. One step, then two. He looked at the ground. He looked at the jagged mountains. He looked everywhere but at her face. He turned his back on her. He walked into the dark barn. He slid the heavy wooden door shut behind him. The latch clicked into place. Clara didn't follow him. Not yet. She had her rules, he had his silence. But the silence was cracking, and what lay buried beneath it was going to change everything. The rain started on a Thursday. It didn't stop. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a Montana deluge, cold, heavy, relentless. It hammered the cabin roof like a fist. It turned the yard into thick brown soup. The creek behind the smokehouse began to roar. It crested its banks by Friday morning. Clara tied a piece of canvas over her head. She pulled her boots high. She waded into the muck. Elias was already out there. He was fighting the mud to move the horses to higher ground. They worked together. No words, just the physical strain of survival. Rain slashed at their faces. The wind tore at their clothes. They pushed the frightened animals up the ridge. They secured the barn doors with heavy iron chains. By Saturday afternoon, the sky finally broke. A pale, weak sun pushed through the bruised clouds. Clara stood on the back porch. Her clothes were soaked. Her hands were raw. She looked out at the damage. The fences were standing. The barn was safe. But the landscape had changed. The creek had carved a new path. The raging water had gnawed away the banks. It had washed out the deep depression behind the stone smokehouse. Clara stepped off the porch. Her boots sank deep into the mud. She walked toward the washout. The air smelled of wet pine and unearthed rot. A heavy, ancient smell. She reached the edge of the collapse. She looked down. Her breath hitched in her throat. The earth had been stripped away, revealing a massive, unnatural pit. It wasn't a root cellar. It wasn't a grave for a single fallen horse. It was a mass grave. Bones. Hundreds of them. Tangled and bleached white against the dark, wet earth. Cattle skulls with hollow eye sockets. The delicate rib cages of sheep. The long leg bones of horses. All of them thrown together, haphazard, buried in secret. Clara slid down the muddy bank. She didn't care about the dirt ruining her dress. She knelt in the mud. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the edge of a rusted metal lockbox, half buried under the skull of a pony. She dug her fingers into the earth. She pulled the box free. The lock had rusted through years ago. It snapped off in her hand. She opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were papers, Bureau of Indian Affairs ledgers, official government letterheads. The ink was faded, but the dates were clear. 7 years ago. It was a disposal log. It detailed the systematic slaughter of 200 head of cattle, 50 horses, and an entire flock of sheep. It wasn't disease. It was an order to starve a people off their own land. And at the bottom of the ledger, signing off on the translation of the military order to Chief Alwyn's people, was a signature. Elias Thorne, BIA interpreter. Clara heard a heavy footstep behind her. She turned. Elias stood at the top of the ridge. He was looking down into the pit. His face was the color of wood ash. His shoulders, usually so broad and immovable, were slumped. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. Clara stood up. She held the ledger in her muddy hands. "Is this it?" Clara asked. Her voice cut through the dripping quiet of the yard. "Is this what the bones remember?" Elias didn't reach for his slate. He didn't have it. He just stared at the bones. His chest heaved, a terrible, ragged breath. Clara climbed back up the muddy bank. She stood directly in front of him. She didn't let him look away. "You translated the orders," Clara said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. "You helped the army take their food, before winter." Elias closed his eyes. A single tear cut a clean line through the mud on his face. He nodded. Once. "Why?" Clara demanded. "Why would you do that?" He opened his eyes. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He looked at the ledger in her hands. He looked at the vast, stolen land around them. His jaw worked. The muscles jumped beneath his skin. He opened his mouth. At first, nothing came out. Just a harsh, scraping sound. A ghost of a voice. He swallowed hard. He tried again. When the words finally came, they were raspy, broken, like a rusty gate swinging open after a decade in the dark. "It was the law," Elias said. Clara gasped. The sound of his voice sent a shock straight to her heart. It was deep, rough, completely human. "They told me it was the law," Elias choked out. He dragged a trembling hand across his face. "They said it was a quarantine. Disease. I translated the lies. I told Alawan his people had to surrender the herds or the army would shoot the men. I used my voice to convince them." He looked down at his own hands, like they were covered in blood. 31 people died that winter," Elias whispered. His voice cracked in half. 12 children. Starved. Because they trusted my words. Clara stared at him. The broken man. The mute rancher who had bought his own silence with guilt. "So you stopped speaking," Clara said softly. "You thought if you never spoke again, you could never hurt anyone else. You bought this land to stand guard over the graves." Elias fell to his knees in the mud, right at the edge of the pit. The massive, silent man, finally crushed by the weight of his own history. "I stayed silent because I thought words were crimes," Elias said. His voice was gaining strength now, fed by years of suppressed agony. He looked up at Clara. His blue eyes burned with a fierce, terrible clarity. Clara stepped closer. She didn't pity him. She respected him too much for that. She needed him to finish, to teach the lesson the earth was demanding. Elias braced his hands on his knees. He pushed himself up. He stood tall. He looked out over the land, toward where Alawan's camp used to be. "But I was wrong," Elias said clearly. Every word carried the weight of an oath. Silence in the face of injustice is the greatest crime of all. My silence didn't bring back the dead. It only protected the government men who ordered the slaughter. It only protected the system. He turned to face Clara. "The right to the truth is the first right owed to both the living and the dead," Elias stated. "Hiding history doesn't erase it. It just lets the rot spread. I will never be silent about this again, not for Sterling, not for the law, not for anyone." Clara looked at the ledger. She looked at Elias. The rain started to fall again. A light mist this time, washing the mud from the pages. "Then we add it to the fight," Clara said. She rolled the papers up carefully. "We fight my cousin for my future, and we fight the Bureau for their past. We use the law to break the law." Elias nodded. He didn't write it down. He didn't need to. He reached out. He placed his large, calloused hand over hers. His palm was warm against her freezing skin. "Together," Elias said. One word, spoken aloud. It was the most powerful contract Clara had ever signed. Winter hit Montana with a vengeance. It didn't ease in. It kicked the door down. November brought a whiteout blizzard. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind howled down from the Beartooth Mountains. It drove the snow sideways. It blinded the eyes and froze the lungs. Clara and Elias were trapped inside. They had dragged firewood into the main room. They stacked it high against the walls. The cast-iron stove burned cherry red. But the corners of the cabin were freezing. Ice crystallized on the inside of the window panes. Then the knock came. A heavy, frantic pounding on the thick wooden door. Elias stood up. He pulled his revolver from its holster. He kept it down by his side. He unlatched the door and pulled it back against the wind. A man fell inside. He was covered in snow. His lips were blue. He was shivering violently. Clara knew him instantly. Harker, a hired gun from Millhaven, a man who worked exclusively for her cousin Sterling. Harker had been trailing her since the day she left town. Elias kicked the door shut. He barred it. He looked at Clara. His eyes flicked to Harker, then back to her. A silent question. "Do we throw him out?" Clara shook her head. They couldn't. It was murder out there, even for a spy. "Get him to the fire," Clara said. Elias dragged Harker to the hearth. He stripped off the man's frozen coat. Clara brought a wool blanket. She handed Harker a tin cup of hot coffee. The man drank it with shaking hands. Harker looked around the cabin. His eyes were sharp, calculating. Even half frozen, he was doing his job. He was looking for cracks. Looking for proof that this engagement was a sham. "Obliged," Harker chattered. He looked at Clara, then at Elias. A sly, nasty smirk touched his blue lips. "Didn't think I'd make it. Sterling sent me to check the property lines, got caught in the blow. Good thing you two lovebirds are keeping the hearth warm." He emphasized the word lovebirds. It was a challenge. Clara felt her stomach tighten. The performance had to begin, now. She walked over to Elias. She didn't hesitate. She sat down on the braided rug right beside him. She leaned her back against his chest. Elias stiffened for a fraction of a second. Then his instinct took over. He wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her close. He rested his chin on the top of her head. It was an act, a lie for Harker's benefit. But it didn't feel like a lie. Elias was solid. He radiated heat. His heartbeat was steady against her shoulder blades. Clara closed her eyes. She let herself lean into him. She let herself feel safe, just for a moment. Harker watched them over the rim of his tin cup. He was looking for hesitation, awkwardness, the space between two people who were only pretending. He didn't find it. Elias shifted. He brought one hand up. He gently rubbed Clara's arm, warming the chill from her skin. His touch was calloused, rough, but incredibly gentle. It sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. Clara turned her head slightly. She rested her cheek against his flannel shirt. She breathed in the smell of him. Cedar wood, cold air, man. "We like the quiet," Clara said to Harker. Her voice was soft, intimate. "We don't need a lot of space, as long as we have each other." Harker scoffed softly. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. He lay down on the floor near the fire. "Ain't that sweet? We'll see how sweet it is when the judge looks at the estate papers." Within an hour, Harker was asleep. His snoring competed with the howling wind outside. Clara didn't move away from Elias. The fire burned down to glowing orange embers. The shadows danced on the log walls. The cabin was a tiny island of warmth in a sea of deadly white. "He'll report back," Clara whispered. She didn't want to wake Harker. She kept her voice so low only Elias could hear. "Let him," Elias whispered back. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. It vibrated against her back. He was still getting used to speaking again. He used his voice sparingly, only for things that mattered. Clara shifted. She turned in his arms so she was facing him. Their faces were inches apart. The glow of the embers painted his strong features in warm light. "You're a good actor," Clara murmured. "I'm not acting," Elias answered. "Simple, honest, devastating." Clara's breath caught. She looked into his eyes. The ice was gone from them, replaced by something warm, something deep. She reached up. She touched the side of his face. His beard was rough against her fingertips. "Elias," she said softly, "this world, it tries to own us. Sterling wants to own my money. The government wanted to own your conscience. When people talk about marriage out here, they talk about ownership, a man taking possession of a woman." Elias frowned. His hand tightened on her waist, a protective reflex. He didn't want to own her. He wanted her free. Clara saw the worry in his eyes. She smiled, a real, beautiful smile. "But that's not what this is," Clara said clearly. She made sure her whisper was sharp enough to carry the weight of her conviction. She looked right into his soul. "I have fought my whole life to belong to myself," Clara stated explicitly. The words were a manifesto whispered in the dark. "I do not need a man to save me, Elias. I am perfectly capable of fighting Sterling in the courts on my own." She moved her hand from his cheek down to his chest. She rested it over his heart. "I need a man to stand beside me as an equal while I save myself," Clara said. Her voice rang with absolute certainty. "True partnership requires equal footing. It is not about a strong man protecting a weak woman. It is about two strong people holding the line together, respecting each other's minds, defending each other's rights. That is the only kind of love worth having." Elias listened. He heard every word. He understood the profound respect she was offering him. She wasn't asking for a savior, she was asking for a partner. He reached up. He covered her hand with his own. He pressed it against his chest. "Equal footing," Elias whispered. He tested the words on his tongue. He liked the taste of them. He leaned in. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, tender press of his lips against her skin. It wasn't a performance for the sleeping spy. It was a promise. "I stand beside you," Elias whispered into her hair, "until the end." Outside, the blizzard raged. The wind tore at the roof. The cold tried to seep through the walls. But inside, sitting on the braided rug, the heartbroken rancher and the disinherited woman held each other. They weren't hiding anymore. They were gathering their strength, getting ready for the thaw and the war that would follow it. If you felt something today, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share this story, and subscribe to follow more journeys like this. The snow melted, the mud returned, and so did Sterling. It was late April. The Beartooth Mountains were still capped in white, but the valley was greening. Clara was on the front porch. She was washing a tin coffee pot in a basin of cold water. She heard the horses first, 3 riders coming up the dirt track. Elias walked out of the barn. He held a pitchfork. He didn't drop it, he didn't raise it. He just held it, loose and ready. He walked to the front of the cabin and stood beside Clara. He was a solid wall of denim and muscle. Sterling rode in front. He wore a sharp, tailored suit. It looked absurd out here in the mud. Beside him was a man with a leather briefcase, a lawyer. The third man wore a silver star pinned to his vest, a United States Marshal. They reined in their horses. Sterling looked down at Clara. His lips curled into a nasty, triumphant smile. "I told you I'd come for you, Clara," Sterling said. Clara dried her hands on her apron. She didn't flinch. "You are trespassing, Sterling. State your business and get off our land." The lawyer cleared his throat. He opened his briefcase. He pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Miss Vance," the lawyer said. His voice was nasal, annoying. My client, Mr. Sterling Vance, has filed a formal petition with the territorial court. We have a writ here signed by Judge Harrison. A writ for what? Clara demanded. The marshal shifted in his saddle. He looked uncomfortable. He looked at Elias. He looked at the pitchfork. Ma'am, the writ claims you are being held against your will. It claims this man, Elias Thorne, is engaging in illegal human trafficking under the guise of an indentured labor contract. Clara laughed. A short, sharp sound. It held absolutely no humor. Trafficking, Clara spat. She stepped down off the porch. Her boots sank into the spring mud. She walked right up to the marshal's horse. I signed that contract of my own free will, in front of 50 witnesses in Millhaven. I am a paid employee of this ranch. You are a confused woman, Sterling interrupted. His tone was dripping with fake pity. You are grieving your father. You are mentally unfit. This mute brute took advantage of your fragile state. I am your nearest male relative. The law grants me guardianship over your person and your father's estate. Elias took a step forward. The pitchfork handle creaked in his grip. Sterling's horse took a nervous step back. Sterling swallowed hard, but he pointed a gloved finger at Elias. Arrest him, Marshal, Sterling ordered. He is holding a vulnerable woman hostage to steal her inheritance. The marshal reached for his holster, not drawing the gun, just resting his hand on it. Thorne, let the lady get her things. She's coming with us. No, Elias said. The word hit the yard like a physical blow. Sterling stared. The lawyer gasped. Even the marshal blinked in shock. The mute rancher had spoken. His voice was rough, deep, unshakable. She stays, Elias said. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. Clara put her hand on Elias's arm, a gentle touch. I have this, her touch said. She turned back to the marshal. Her eyes were blazing. She wasn't just fighting for her ranch. She was fighting for her humanity. Listen to me very carefully, Marshal, Clara said. Her voice rang out clear and sharp. Every syllable was precise. This contract is a voluntary alliance between two free individuals. I am not property. I am not a child. I am a citizen of this country. The law has no jurisdiction to dictate how a man and a woman choose to protect one another from tyranny and abuse. The lawyer waved his papers. The law explicitly states that an unmarried woman without property must... The law is wrong, Clara cut him off. Her voice cracked like a whip. And you know it. You are twisting statutes to facilitate a theft. She pointed a finger straight at Sterling. You do not care about my well-being, Clara declared. You care about my father's money. You are using the legal system to enforce a patriarchal hierarchy that treats women as livestock. It is a systematic denial of human dignity. She turned back to the marshal. She looked him dead in the eye. I demand you recognize my bodily autonomy, Clara stated explicitly. She refused to soften the words. I am here by choice. Elias Thorne treats me as an equal partner. He respects my mind. My cousin only respects my bank account. If you force me onto that horse, Marshal, you are not upholding the law. You are participating in a kidnapping. The yard went dead silent. The wind ruffled the horses' manes. The creek rushed in the background. The marshal looked at Clara. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He saw the way she stood. Proud. Unbroken. He looked at Elias, who stood shoulder to shoulder with her, not in front of her. An equal. The marshal slowly took his hand off his gun belt. The lady says she's here by choice, Mr. Vance, the marshal said. His voice was gruff, final. You have a judge's order, Sterling shouted. His face was purple with rage. I have an order to investigate a kidnapping, the marshal corrected him. I don't see one. I see a labor dispute. Take it up in civil court. I'm not dragging a screaming, sane woman across the county. The marshal pulled his horse around. He tipped his hat to Clara. Ma'am. He rode out of the yard. The lawyer looked at Sterling. He quickly shoved his papers back into his briefcase. He turned his horse and followed the marshal. Sterling sat alone in the yard. He was shaking with fury. He glared at Clara. Then he glared at Elias. "This isn't over," Sterling hissed. "I'll bleed you dry in the courts. I'll take the land. I'll take the money. I'll leave you both with nothing." He spurred his horse. He galloped out of the yard, throwing mud in his wake. Clara stood in the dirt. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The adrenaline began to fade. Her knees went weak. She swayed, just a fraction. Elias dropped the pitchfork. He caught her by the waist. His strong arms held her steady. Clara looked up at him. She let out a shaky breath. "He'll be back." "I know," Elias said. "We need money," Clara whispered. "To fight a civil suit, we need lawyers. Good ones, we need capital. We have $40 and a few head of cattle." Elias looked out at the rolling hills of the ranch. The land he had bought to be a graveyard. The land she was turning into a home. "The land will provide," Elias said softly. He didn't know how true those words would be. He didn't know what was buried beneath the dry dirt waiting for them. Summer came down hard. June was hot. July was a furnace. The Montana sky turned a washed-out dusty blue. No rain fell. The grass turned brown and brittle. It crunched underfoot like shattered glass. The creek behind the smokehouse slowed to a trickle. Then it became a string of muddy puddles. Then it baked into cracked clay. The ranch was dying of thirst. Clara stood by the old stone well near the cabin. She lowered the wooden bucket. The rope slipped through her calloused hands. It hit the bottom. It didn't splash. It thudded. She hauled it up. Dry dirt. A few pebbles. Nothing else. Elias walked up beside her. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty bandana. He looked into the empty bucket. His jaw tightened. Without water, the cattle would die in a week. Without cattle, the ranch would fold. Sterling wouldn't even need a courtroom. The drought would do his dirty work for him. "We dig," Elias said. He didn't waste time. He walked the property. He watched the subtle dips in the terrain. He looked for the greenest patches of dying grass. He chose a spot near the northern fence line. At the base of a rocky incline, they started digging at dawn. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. The sun beat down on their necks. The dirt was baked hard as brick. Elias used a pickaxe to break the soil. Clara used a heavy iron shovel to clear the loose dirt. They worked in a rhythm. Pick, shovel, toss. Pick, shovel, toss. Their clothes clung to their backs. Dust coated their skin, turning their sweat into a gritty paste. They didn't speak. They saved their breath for the work. By the third day, the hole was 10 feet deep. Elias was down in the pit. Clara stood at the top, hauling up buckets of dirt with a makeshift rope and pulley. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned, but she didn't stop. Elias swung the pickaxe. It struck something hard. A sharp, ringing clink echoed up from the hole. Not dirt, not shale. Rock, solid rock. Elias dropped the pick. He knelt in the dirt. He used his bare hands to clear the soil away from the strike point. Clara leaned over the edge. "Did we hit water?" Elias didn't answer right away. He kept digging with his fingers, tearing his nails on the hard earth. He stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his canteen. It was half empty. He didn't drink. He poured the precious water over the rock he had just unearthed. He scrubbed it with his thumb. He looked up at Clara. The shadow of the hole hid his eyes, but she could see the rigid set of his shoulders. "Drop the bucket," Elias said. His voice was strange, tight. Clara lowered the wooden bucket. Elias placed a chunk of rock inside. "Pull it up." Clara hauled the bucket to the surface. She reached inside. The rock was heavy, unusually heavy for its size. It was crusted with mud. But where Elias had washed it, something caught the harsh afternoon sun. A dull yellow gleam. It wasn't iron pyrite. It wasn't fool's gold. Clara's father had been an investor. She had seen raw ore in his study. She knew the luster. She knew the weight. It was gold. A thick, rich vein of it, sitting right beneath their land. Clara stared at the rock. Her breath caught in her throat. The heat of the day vanished. A cold, terrifying realization washed over her. "Sterling," Clara whispered. Elias climbed out of the hole. He hauled himself up over the edge. He stood beside her, covered in dirt and sweat. He looked at the gold in her hand. "He knew," Clara said. Her voice shook. She looked up at Elias. The puzzle pieces slammed together in her mind, a perfect, ugly picture. "He didn't care about my father's estate in Chicago. He didn't care about the railroad rights out here. He had this land surveyed before my father died. He knew the gold was here." Elias looked at the hole. He looked at the vast, dry valley. "He pushed me out here to isolate me," Clara continued. The anger began to boil up, replacing the shock. "He thought I would fail. He thought I would run back to town and sell him the deed for a train ticket. And when you bought my contract, you ruined his plan. That's why he brought the marshal. He doesn't want me. He wants the mine." Clara gripped the gold rock. "This is it, Elias. This is our capital. We can hire the best lawyers in the territory. We can crush him." Elias didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He looked at the gold with absolute disgust. He reached out. He took the heavy rock from Clara's hand. He held it up to the sun. "No," Elias said. Clara frowned. "What do you mean, no?" "This is the answer to our prayers." "This is poison," Elias said. His voice was low, a deep, resonant rumble that demanded complete attention. He turned to face Clara. "Listen to me, Clara," Elias stated explicitly. He locked his blue eyes onto hers. "Gold blinds the greedy, but justice illuminates the righteous. If we use this gold just to get rich, just to buy fancy lawyers and build a big house, we are no better than Sterling." Clara stared at him. "Elias, it secures my freedom." "Your freedom cannot be bought with dirty earth," Elias said passionately. He pointed toward the southern boundary, toward the hidden pit of bones. "We are standing on a graveyard," Elias declared. The educational value of his words was unmistakable. He was delivering a moral verdict. "This land was stolen through lies and starvation. The government took it. I helped them do it. We cannot harvest wealth from the soil that drank the blood of Alawan's people." Clara felt the truth of his words. They cut through her desperation. They cut through her fear of Sterling. "We will not hoard this," Elias continued. He gripped the gold rock so hard his knuckles turned white. "We will use this wealth to build a school. We will use it to pay reparations to the families who bled on this soil. True wealth is not what you keep in a bank, Clara. It is the harm you repair in your community." Clara looked at the exhausted, dirty, heartbroken rancher. He had nothing. He lived in a drafty cabin and broke his back for a few cattle. But his soul was completely incorruptible. She realized in that moment that she didn't just respect him. She didn't just consider him a partner. She loved him. Not the fake love she had offered to buy for $500, the real kind. The kind that terrified her. Clara reached out. She placed her dirt-stained hands over his, over the gold rock. "We fight Sterling with the truth," Clara said softly. "And we heal this land with the gold." Elias looked down at her hands, then up at her face. The tension melted from his jaw. He nodded. "Equal footing," Elias said. "Always," Clara promised. They turned back to the hole. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows over the gold. They still had to find water. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, they knew exactly what they were fighting for. The Millhaven courthouse smelled of floor wax and stale sweat. It was August. The heat was trapped inside the wooden walls. Ceiling fans turned lazily. They didn't cool the air, they just pushed the hot dust around. Clara sat at a heavy oak table. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded over her leather satchel. Elias sat beside her. He wore a clean canvas shirt. His jaw was locked tight. Across the aisle sat Sterling. He looked cool, comfortable. He wore a light gray suit. His lawyer, a man named Gable, was pacing in front of the judge's bench. Judge Harrison wiped his brow with a handkerchief. He looked tired. He looked like a man who just wanted to go home and drink cold tea. "Your Honor," Gable said. His voice was loud, practiced. "This is not a complicated matter. Clara Vance is a grieving woman. Her father recently passed. She is alone in a harsh territory. She is not of sound mind to manage a massive estate." Clara gripped her hands together. She didn't interrupt, not yet. "Furthermore," Gable continued, he pointed a long, bony finger at Elias. "She claims to be under the protection of this man, an indentured laborer, a man the whole town knows is a cripple." Elias didn't flinch. He just stared at Gable, cold and steady. "He is a mute, Your Honor," Gable said, pacing back toward Sterling. "A man whose mind is so broken he cannot even form words. He cannot swear a legal oath. He cannot testify in his own defense. He is legally incompetent. How can a man who cannot govern his own tongue be trusted to govern a woman's estate?" Sterling smiled, a thin, mean line. Judge Harrison sighed. He looked down at Clara. "Miss Vance, the court is inclined to agree with your cousin. The frontier is no place for a woman without proper sound guardianship." Clara stood up. She pushed her chair back. It scraped loudly against the wooden floor. Every eye in the courtroom turned to her. "Your Honor," Clara said. Her voice was crystal clear. It cut through the stifling heat. "I do not need guardianship. I need the law to do its job. I need it to protect me from theft." "Miss Vance," the judge warned. "My mind is perfectly sound," Clara continued. She stepped out from behind the table. "I have managed the ranch's books. I have filed the necessary injunctions. I have proven my competence. My cousin is using the excuse of my gender to steal my inheritance." "Objection," Gable barked. "I am speaking," Clara snapped. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked right at the judge. "The law is supposed to be a shield, but men like my cousin use it as a sword. He calls Elias Thorne a cripple. He calls him incompetent. But Elias has built a ranch from dirt. He has shown me more respect in 6 months than my cousin has in a lifetime." Sterling stood up. He slammed his hand on his table. He lost his cool veneer. "Listen to her," Sterling shouted. "She is hysterical. She is defending a half-wit, a man who stands there like a dumb animal while she fights his battles. He's not a protector. He's a pathetic, voiceless freak." The courtroom held its breath. Clara opened her mouth to tear Sterling apart, but Elias stood up. He didn't move fast. He moved with absolute terrifying purpose. He stepped past Clara. He walked right to the center of the aisle. He looked at Sterling. He looked at Gable. Then he looked up at the judge. Elias closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He pulled in a deep breath of the hot, stale air. He reached down into the dark, silent place where he had buried his voice. He grabbed hold of it, and he pulled it into the light. "I am heartbroken," Elias said. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The judge dropped his pen. Sterling took a step back. The gallery gasped. The mute rancher had spoken. His voice was rough, deep as a canyon. It carried the weight of years of silent agony. "I am heartbroken," Elias repeated, louder this time, steadier. "But I am not voiceless." He turned slowly. He looked directly at Sterling. "You call me a cripple," Elias said. Every syllable was deliberate, a hammer striking an anvil. "You think my silence makes me less of a man. You think it makes me weak. You are wrong." Elias turned back to Judge Harrison. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared. "Your Honor," Elias stated explicitly. His voice rang with undeniable authority. "A man's worth is not measured by the smoothness of his speech. It is not measured by the scars on his mind. Clara Vance taught me that. She taught me that true compassion doesn't require a contract. It requires respect." He pointed a calloused finger at Sterling's lawyer. "The law must protect the vulnerable," Elias declared. He made sure every person in the gallery heard the lesson. It must not weaponize their pain. You try to use my past trauma as a legal loophole. You try to use her gender as an excuse for robbery. That is not justice. That is corruption wearing a suit. Judge Harrison stared at Elias. He was completely captivated. Elias turned and looked at Clara. His blue eyes were fierce, proud. "I choose to speak today to defend this woman's autonomy," Elias said. His voice softened. "Just a fraction. Just for her. She is my equal. In work. In mind. In law. I swear before this court that she is of sound mind. And I swear that anyone who tries to take her off my land will have to go through me." He didn't yell the threat. He stated it as a simple fact of nature, like gravity. Elias walked back to the table. He sat down. He looked straight ahead. The courtroom was dead silent. The only sound was the slow turning of the ceiling fans. Sterling looked panicked. He looked at his lawyer. Gable was quickly shuffling papers, trying to find a rebuttal to a man who had just dismantled their entire strategy with a handful of words. Judge Harrison picked up his gavel. He didn't bang it. He just held it. "The petition for guardianship is denied," Judge Harrison said quietly. He looked at Sterling with pure disgust. "Miss Vance is clearly of sound mind, and she has secured adequate and highly capable partnership. Case dismissed." The gavel fell. A sharp crack of wood. Sterling turned pale. He glared at Clara. Then he glared at Elias. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't say a word. He turned and marched out of the courtroom. Clara sat down beside Elias. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from absolute awe. She reached under the table. She found his hand. His knuckles were white. The effort of speaking, of breaking his vow in public, had taken a massive toll. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They had won the battle. But as they walked out into the blinding Montana sun, Clara knew the truth. Sterling had lost the law. Now he would use fire. Smoke woke her. Thick, biting. It burned the back of her throat. Clara sat up in bed. The room was dark, but the window was glowing. An ugly, crawling orange. She threw off the wool blanket. She didn't bother with her boots. She ran into the main room. Elias was already there. He was pulling on his boots. His face was grim in the flickering light coming through the door. "The barn," Elias said. His voice was still raspy. They ran out onto the porch. The heat hit them instantly. The barn was fully engulfed. Flames licked up the dry wooden siding. They curled over the roof, reaching for the black sky. The roar of the fire sounded like a freight train. Clara heard the horses, a panicked, high-pitched screaming. "The horses!" Clara yelled. She ran toward the blaze. Elias grabbed her arm. He pulled her back. "Too hot!" Elias shouted over the roar. "I'll go. Get to the pump. Wet the cabin roof." He didn't wait for her answer. He grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from the porch rail. He soaked it in the water trough. He threw it over his head and ran straight into the burning barn. Clara's heart stopped. She watched him disappear into the smoke. She didn't freeze. She couldn't. She ran to the iron pump. She pumped the handle frantically. Cold water gushed into a wooden bucket. She hauled it up the porch steps. She threw it against the log wall of the cabin. She ran back for more. A heavy crack echoed through the night. The roof of the barn was caving in. "Elias!" Clara screamed. Two massive draft horses burst through the smoke. They were terrified, blinded by the heat, but they were out. A second later, Elias stumbled out behind them. His canvas coat was smoking. His face was covered in black soot. He fell to his knees in the dirt, coughing violently. Clara dropped the bucket. She ran to him. She pulled the smoking blanket off his head. "I'm all right," Elias gasped. He waved her off. He pointed toward the darkness beyond the fire. "Look." Clara squinted through the smoke. 3 riders were galloping away, heading east, toward Millhaven. One of them held an unlit torch. Sterling's men. They had come in the dead of night, desperate men doing desperate things. The fire was spreading, the dry grass caught fast. A wall of flame began to march toward the back of the property, toward the smokehouse, toward the washout. The pit, Clara realized. The gold. Elias stood up. He watched the flames race up the hillside. The heat was baking the earth. Suddenly, a deep, rumbling groan shook the ground. It sounded like an earthquake. The fire had burned away the roots holding the hillside together. The intense heat cracked the dry clay. The entire bank above the washout gave way. Thousands of pounds of dirt, rock, and shale slid down the hill. A massive landslide. It buried the old stone smokehouse. It buried the bone pit. And it buried the gold vein under 30 feet of impenetrable rock and earth. The earth took it all back. Clara and Elias stood side by side. They watched the fortune and the tragic history disappear forever. They couldn't fight the grass fire. It was too big. They stood near the cabin, ready to wet the walls again if the wind shifted. They were alone against the inferno. Then Clara heard a sound. Not the fire, not the wind. Hoofbeats. Dozens of them. She looked west. Out of the darkness, riders appeared. Chief Alowan led the charge. Behind him were 20 indigenous men and women. They carried heavy wool blankets and woven baskets. And they weren't alone. Coming from the north road was a wagon. It was driven by Lars and Ingrid, the Swedish homesteaders from the next valley over. They had rain barrels strapped to the back of their cart. They rode right into the yard. Nobody asked questions. Nobody hesitated. Alowan jumped down from his horse. He pointed his men toward the advancing grass fire. They began beating the flames with heavy, wet blankets, stifling the fire's oxygen. Ingrid hopped off the wagon. She tossed Clara a tin bucket. "Form a line," the Swedish woman yelled. They formed a bucket brigade from the creek to the edge of the fire. Elias, Clara, Lars, Alowan, men and women, indigenous and immigrant, they worked for hours. Muscles burning, lungs aching, passing water, beating flames, digging trenches in the dirt to stop the spread. By dawn, the fire was dead. The barn was a pile of smoldering ash. The hillside was a massive, scarred scar of dirt. But the cabin stood. And the pastures beyond the creek were safe. The sun came up, a bruised, smoky sunrise. Everyone was covered in soot, exhausted. They stood in the yard, breathing heavily, drinking from the wooden dippers Lars passed around. Clara looked at the crowd. These were people who barely spoke the same language, people who the law said should be divided. But they had stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Alowan walked over to Elias. The old chief looked at the smoking ruins of the barn. He looked at the landslide that had buried the bones of his ancestors. "The earth is closed now," Alowan said softly to Elias. "The past is buried. You do not have to stand guard anymore." Elias nodded. He looked at the soot-covered faces of his neighbors. He looked at Alowan. "I don't know how to repay you," Elias said. His voice was hoarse from the smoke. Alowan turned to face the group. He raised his hand. He demanded attention not through volume, but through absolute presence. "There is no debt," Alowan stated explicitly. He looked at Clara, then at Lars, then at his own people. He made sure the educational truth of the night was spoken aloud. "Look at your hands," Alowan commanded. Clara looked down. Her hands were black with ash and mud. She looked at Elias's hands, at Ingrid's, at Alowan's. Under the soot, they all looked exactly the same. "Fire does not care about the color of the hands that carry the water to put it out," Alowan declared. His voice echoed off the remaining stone walls. "The flames do not ask if you are a man or a woman. They do not ask what language you speak. They only ask if you are willing to fight." He stepped closer to Elias and Clara. "Our survival as a civilized people depends entirely on treating every human life with equal and unwavering respect," Alowan said. "We did not save your home because of a contract. We saved it because we share this land. If one house burns, we all choke on the smoke." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked at Elias. He was staring at Olawan. The burden of guilt that had crushed him for years was finally lifting. The fire had taken the gold, but it had burned away the isolation. They had lost a fortune in the dirt. But standing in the ashes, surrounded by a community built on mutual respect, Clara knew they had gained something infinitely more valuable. They had gained a home. A year passed. The earth healed. It always does. September returned to the Montana territory. The air turned crisp. The cottonwoods along the creek bled bright gold. The sky was that deep, endless blue that made a person feel incredibly small and entirely free. The Thorn Ranch looked different. The scars of the fire were still there. Blackened stumps at the edge of the tree line. A patch of earth where the grass grew back a little too green. But the barn was new, built with fresh pine and heavy iron nails. Lars and the other neighbors had helped raise it in a single weekend. The great landslide behind the smokehouse was quiet. The earth had settled over the bones, over the gold. Nature had locked the vault. It had buried the past and left the present clean. Clara stood on the porch. She held a piece of paper in her hand. It was a bank draft from Chicago. Sterling was gone. The territorial court had finally ruled. Clara Vance was of sound mind. She was the sole legal heir to her father's estate. Sterling had tried to appeal, but his funds ran dry. He packed his expensive suits and took a train back east. He was a ghost, a bad memory fading in the sun. Clara looked down at the paper. She had her money. She had her name. She had her independence. She walked off the porch. Elias was in the corral. He was brushing down a young bay mare. He moved with the same steady, rhythmic grace he always had. The long, brutal winter and the scorching summer hadn't broken him. The fire hadn't broken him. If anything, he looked more solid, more rooted to the dirt. He heard her boots on the dry earth. He turned. His eyes found hers. Winter sky blue, but warm now. The heavy, suffocating shadow of guilt was gone. He still didn't speak, just to fill the silence. He only used his voice when it mattered. But the silence between them wasn't a wall anymore. It was a bridge. Mail came, Clara said. Elias patted the mare's neck. He draped the brush over the fence rail. He walked over to her. He wiped his hands on his denim thighs. "Good news?" Elias asked. His voice was a deep, quiet rumble. "The best," Clara said. "The estate is settled. The funds have been transferred to the Millhaven Bank under my name. Only my name. Sterling has officially forfeited all claims." Elias nodded. A slow, proud smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You fought him. And you won." "We won," Clara corrected him. She reached into the pocket of her wool skirt. She pulled out a small, rectangular slip of paper. It wasn't the bank draft from Chicago. It was a personal check, written from her new account. She held it out to him. Elias looked at it. He didn't take it. He read the numbers written in her elegant, sweeping handwriting. $500. "What is this?" Elias asked. The smile faded. A line of confusion appeared between his brows. "A debt," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was beating hard against her ribs. "A year ago, outside Amos Pike's Mercantile, I made you an offer. I told you I would pay you $500 to pretend you loved me, to be my protector until I got my inheritance back." Elias stared at her. He didn't move. "You didn't take the money then," Clara continued. "You bought my labor contract instead. You gave me a safe place to stand while I fought the courts. You gave me a home. But I made a promise, and I honor my debts." Elias looked from the check to her face. His jaw tightened. "I don't want your money, Clara," Elias said. His voice dropped. It sounded almost hurt. "Take it," Clara insisted. She pressed the paper against his chest. "Please, it's important. It's important that you take it." Elias slowly raised his hand. He took the check. He held it between his rough, calloused fingers. It looked fragile in his hands. A tiny piece of paper holding a fortune. "Why is this important?" Elias asked. He looked deeply into her eyes, searching for the truth. Clara took a step back. She needed space to say this. She needed him to understand the absolute, undeniable reality of her freedom. "Because a year ago I was a hostage," Clara stated explicitly. Her voice rang out across the quiet corral. "I was a woman trapped by a legal system that saw me as property. I was fighting for my dignity. When I came to you, I came out of desperation. I bought your protection because I had no power of my own." She looked at the check in his hand. Then she looked back up at his face. "But I am not desperate anymore," Clara declared. "I am a fully independent woman, recognized by the law. I own my own future. By paying that debt, I am closing the contract. I am proving that I do not owe anyone anything. Not my cousin, not the courts, not even you." Elias listened. He heard the fierce pride in her voice. He understood what she was doing. She wasn't pushing him away. She was leveling the ground. She was standing at the summit of the mountain she had climbed, planting her flag. He looked down at the check. $500. It could buy 100 head of cattle. It could buy lumber. It could buy land. Elias grasped the paper with both hands. He ripped it right down the middle. Clara gasped. Elias put the two halves together. He tore them again and again, until the check was nothing but a handful of white confetti. He opened his hands. The autumn wind caught the pieces. It scattered them across the dirt, blowing them away into the tall grass. Gone. "Elias," Clara breathed. He stepped toward her. He closed the distance she had put between them. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. "The debt is canceled," Elias said. His voice was thick with emotion, rough, real. "You don't owe me protection. You don't owe me a performance. The contract is dead." He let go of her hands. He reached up and framed her face with his palms. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. "Stay," Elias said. One word, spoken with the weight of a vow. He looked straight into her soul. He made sure there was absolutely no shadow between them. No debt, no obligation. "Stay," Elias repeated. "Because you want to. Not because you paid. Not because you need a guard. Because you choose to." Clara looked up at the heartbreak-healed rancher. The man who had found his voice just to defend her rights. The man who had turned away a fortune in gold to honor the dead. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she didn't blink them away. She smiled. She placed her hands over his. She held them against her face. "This is what I wanted to prove," Clara said softly. But her words carried the weight of a lifetime of learning. She spoke them aloud, not just for him, but for the wind to hear, for the land to hear. "Listen to me, Elias," Clara said, her voice trembling with absolute clarity. "Society tells women that love is a transaction. They tell us it is a trade. We trade our names, our property, and our autonomy in exchange for a man's protection. It is a system built on inequality." Elias nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you refused that," Clara declared explicitly. "You refused to own me. You forced me to fight my own battles, but you stood right beside me while I did it. You demanded that we stand on equal footing." She stepped even closer. Her chest brushed against his. "Love cannot exist in a cage," Clara stated, her voice ringing out. It was her final verdict, her ultimate truth. "It cannot exist where one person holds power over the other. Love only holds true value when it is given absolutely for free, between two people who stand completely equal in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of each other." Elias's chest hitched. He let out a ragged breath, a breath that sounded like a laugh and a prayer, all mixed into one. "Are we equal, Clara?" Elias asked softly. "We are," Clara answered. "Are you free?" "Entirely." "Then I love you," Elias said. He didn't whisper it. He said it loud, a man who had found his voice and knew exactly what it was for. "I love you, for free, for always." "And I love you," Clara said. Elias lowered his head. He kissed her. It wasn't a performance for a spy in a freezing cabin. It wasn't a desperate grab for comfort in the dark. It was a choice, a deliberate, joyful collision of two free souls. It tasted like sunlight and dust, like a hard-won victory. The wind blew across the Montana plains. It rattled the yellow leaves of the willow trees. It swept over the buried history of the valley and over the fresh pine of the new barn. Clara wrapped her arms around Elias's neck. She held him close. She belonged to herself, completely. And because she belonged to herself, she could finally give her heart away. She didn't need to buy her survival anymore. She had built it, with dirt and ink and fire and truth. The heartbroken rancher had done the hardest thing a man could do. He had listened, he had spoken the truth, and he had treated a woman like an equal. And in doing so, he had saved them both. This story reminds us that true freedom cannot be given. It must be claimed. Love is not ownership, and justice is not always written in law, but in courage and truth. If this story moved you, this channel is dedicated to Western cowboy tales, frontier love, family bonds, compassion, and the quiet strength between people. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
This story reminds us that true freedom cannot be given. It must be claimed. Love is not ownership, and justice is not always written in law, but in courage and truth. If this story moved you, this channel is dedicated to Western cowboy tales, frontier love, family bonds, compassion, and the quiet strength between people. If you felt something today, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share this story, and subscribe to follow more journeys like this. Out there on the wide Montana plains, where the wind carries both dust and memory, this story leaves us with something far greater than a tale of survival. It reminds us that freedom is never simply given. It is claimed, protected, and sometimes painfully earned. Clara Vance did not win because someone saved her. She won because she refused to surrender her dignity, because she chose to stand her ground, even when the law itself stood against her. And Elias Thorne, he teaches us something just as powerful, that silence in the face of injustice can wound just as deeply as wrongdoing itself, but that it is never too late to find your voice and use it for truth. What makes this story linger is not just the hardship, nor the quiet romance that grew between two wounded souls. It is the idea of equality, not the kind spoken about in courtrooms, but the kind lived, proven, and fought for in the dust of everyday life. Clara did not need a man to rescue her. She needed someone who would stand beside her, not above her. And Elias, a man burdened by guilt and silence, learned that love is not protection, not ownership, but partnership. Two people choosing each other freely, without chains, without debt. That is where real strength lies. There is also a deeper truth buried beneath the land itself. The story reminds us that justice is not only about the present, it is about the past we choose to acknowledge. The land they fought for carried history, pain, and voices long ignored. And through that, we are reminded that true righteousness is not built on forgetting, but on facing what came before and choosing to do better. Compassion, accountability, and respect for every human life, these are the foundations of a world worth building. In the end, what Clara and Elias found was not gold, not victory in the traditional sense, but something far more valuable, a life built on truth, mutual respect, and freely given love. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that the things we fight hardest for are not wealth or power, but the right to stand as ourselves, to love without fear, and to walk our own path under an open sky. So as this story comes to a close, take a moment to reflect on the choices you make, on the courage you carry, and on the way you treat those beside you. Because out here, whether on the frontier or in our own lives, What defines us is not what we own, but what we stand for. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.